There are certain phrases that burn themselves into your memory, like brands on skin. Words that echo through the years, no matter how hard you try to silence them. Get out of my house. I don't need a sick daughter. Those were the last words my father said to me before he shoved me onto the porch and locked the door behind me. I was 15 years old. It was October, and rain was already hammering against the windows in sheets that looked grey and violent in the fading light. No jacket, because I hadn't known I would need one when I left for school that morning. No phone, because it was charging on my bedroom nightstand upstairs. No money, except maybe some loose change at the bottom of my backpack. Not even enough for a bus fare to anywhere safe. Just textbooks and half-finished algebra homework, and the innocent assumption that I would sleep in my own bed that night, like I had every night of my 15 years on Earth. 3 hours later, the police called him with news that made his face drain of every drop of colour. But by that point, the damage was already done in ways that neither of us fully understood yet. I remember coming home from school that day, thinking about the algebra test I'd just aced, and the band poster I'd been saving my allowance to buy. Normal, shallow concerns of a 15-year-old honours student who thought she understood how the world worked. The moment I walked through our front door, though, I knew something had gone terribly wrong. My father was standing in the living room looking like a man possessed, his face an alarming shade of red, and his hands trembling as he clutched a wad of cash in one fist and several empty pill bottles in the other. My sister Karen stood directly behind him, with an expression of perfect concern on her face. Worried older sister discovering something terrible about her baby sibling. But I caught the flash in her eyes before she remembered to mask it. Satisfaction. Bright and vicious and unmistakable. She was 19 then, 4 years my senior, and she'd spent those 4 years perfecting the art of looking innocent while destroying things behind the scenes. Our stepmother Jolene hovered in the kitchen doorway, saying absolutely nothing, because that was her speciality, being present but silent while terrible things unfolded, maintaining plausible deniability for whatever came next. My father didn't give me time to put down my backpack or ask what was wrong. He just started screaming that I'd been stealing from his wallet for months, buying pills with that stolen money, hiding them in my room like some kind of addict. He said Karen had found all the evidence that afternoon while I was at school, cash stuffed into my dresser drawers and pill bottles shoved to the back of my closet, and text messages proving I was in contact with drug dealers. I tried to tell him it wasn't true, that I'd never touched his wallet or seen those pills, but the words came out weak and unconvincing because I was too shocked to form coherent sentences. And then I realised something that made my blood go cold. He wasn't listening to anything I said. His mind had already been made up hours ago. Probably the moment Karen came to him with her manufactured evidence and her crocodile tears. She'd spent the entire day preparing him, feeding him lies in small digestible pieces, building a narrative so convincing that my denials sounded like exactly what you'd expect from a guilty person trying to weasel out of consequences. Karen stood there behind him, looking devastated and martyred, telling him how hard she'd tried to help me, how she'd suspected something was wrong for weeks, but hadn't wanted to believe it. She said she'd tried to talk to me privately, but I'd refused to listen, and now she had no choice but to tell him the truth, because she couldn't stand by and watch me destroy myself. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Every word carefully chosen, every tear perfectly timed, and my father swallowed it all, because Karen had always been his favourite, and I had always been the difficult one, who reminded him too much of my dead mother. He grabbed my arm hard enough that I knew I'd have bruises the next day, finger-shaped marks in purple and yellow, and dragged me toward the front door. My backpack was still on the floor where I'd dropped it, and he snatched it up and threw it at my chest, with enough force that I had to step backward to keep my balance. Then he opened the door, and I saw the rain sheeting down in grey curtains, saw the wind tearing leaves off the trees and sending them skittering across our lawn like frightened animals. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since that morning when I'd left for school in just a light sweater, and the weather report had been warning about dangerous conditions all day, hypothermia risks for anyone caught outside without proper protection. My father looked me directly in the eyes with an expression of disgust so profound that it felt like physical pain, and he repeated those words that would haunt me for 13 years afterward. He told me to get out of his house, said he didn't need a daughter who was sick, who was broken, who had betrayed his trust and corrupted herself beyond redemption. Then he put his hands on my shoulders and shoved me backward onto the porch, with enough force that I nearly lost my footing on the wet boards. The door slammed shut before I could say another word, and I heard the deadbolt slide into place with a sound like a gunshot, final and irreversible. And just like that, I was homeless, at 15 years old, with a storm bearing down and nowhere to go. I stood on that porch for maybe 5 minutes in a state of complete paralysis, waiting for the door to open again, expecting someone to realize this was insane and call me back inside. Nobody came, and the rain kept falling harder, and eventually my body made the decision my brain couldn't. It started moving, because standing still meant freezing to death right there on my father's porch. My phone was upstairs charging, useless to me now. My jacket was in the hall closet on the other side of that locked door. All I had was my backpack, with its textbooks and one squashed granola bar at the bottom. Absolutely nothing that would help me survive a night in dangerous weather. This was 2011, and payphones still existed somewhere, in theory, but who carried quarters anymore? What teenager bothered keeping change for emergency calls they never imagined needing to make? So I started walking toward the only place that had ever felt truly safe to me. My grandmother Dorothy's house was 7 miles away on the other side of town. 7 miles that seemed like nothing when you drove it in a warm car with music playing, but became an unimaginable distance when you were walking through freezing rain in canvas sneakers that were already soaked through. Route 9 stretched ahead of me, dark and slick and endless. Cars passing in sprays of water without slowing down, because I was just a shadow on the shoulder. A shape that drivers chose not to look at too closely, because stopping would mean getting involved in someone else's tragedy. After the first mile, my clothes were plastered to my skin, and I could feel the cold working its way into my bones. After the second mile, my fingers had gone numb, and I couldn't feel my toes anymore. After the third mile, my teeth were chattering so violently I thought they might crack, and I had to concentrate on putting one foot in front of the other because my body wanted to stop, wanted to sit down just for a minute and rest. But I knew somewhere in the back of my mind that sitting down would be the end, that if I stopped moving, I might never start again. So I kept walking toward my grandmother's house like it was a lighthouse in a storm, and I was a ship trying desperately not to sink. The thing about hypothermia is how it sneaks up on you, shutting down your body piece by piece, so gradually that you don't realize what's happening until you're already too far gone. Your thinking gets foggy because your brain isn't getting enough oxygen, and suddenly sitting down for just a minute seems like the most brilliant idea you've ever had. Just a quick rest before you keep going. That's when hypothermia has you in its grip, and it's whispering lies that sound like common sense. I made it 4 miles before my legs gave out without warning, just buckled underneath me like they'd been cut off at the knees. There was a mailbox up ahead, and I remember thinking I would just lean against it for a second, just long enough to get my strength back before I pushed on the final 3 miles. But my knees hit the gravel shoulder before I made it to that mailbox, and the impact sent a jolt through my whole body. And then the world started tilting sideways, and everything went black. And the last thought I had before consciousness left me completely was wondering if anyone would find me before the cold finished what my father had started. 3 hours after throwing his daughter out into a dangerous storm, my father's phone rang with a call that would change everything he thought he understood about that night. The voice on the other end was cold and professional, in that way that police officers have when they're delivering news that's going to ruin someone's evening. Identifying himself as Officer Daniels with the county police department, calling about an incident involving his daughter. They'd found a 15-year-old girl unconscious on Route 9, he said, suffering from severe hypothermia and exposure, currently being transported to County General Hospital, where doctors were working to stabilise her. And then Officer Daniels added one more thing, in that same neutral tone. Said that Child Protective Services had already been notified and a caseworker was en route to the hospital. That they had some questions about why a teenage girl had been walking alone in dangerous weather with no coat and no phone and no way to call for help. They were going to need my father to come down to the hospital immediately and bring whatever evidence he had to support his explanation for what had happened. I wasn't conscious when my father arrived at the hospital, but the staff told me later that his face went pale as old bone when he walked into the emergency room, that he looked like a man watching his entire world crumble in slow motion. Karen was standing right next to him when that phone call came through, and her perfect mask of concern slipped for just a fraction of a second. But it was enough for him to catch it if he'd been paying attention. Years later, I would wonder if that was the first moment he started to question her story. If some small doubt began to take root in his mind, even though he wasn't ready to acknowledge it yet. But at the time, he was too focused on his own panic to notice much of anything, except the fact that his daughter was in the hospital and Child Protective Services was involved, and everything was spiraling out of control. Here's the thing that nobody in my family knew about that night. The detail that would end up changing everything. The woman who found me unconscious on that roadside wasn't just some random Good Samaritan driving home from work. Her name was Gloria Hensley, and she'd spent 35 years working for Child Protective Services, 3.5 decades of investigating abuse and neglect cases, of interviewing traumatized children and lying parents, of seeing every possible variation of how adults hurt kids and then try to justify it afterward. She had developed a sixth sense for when something was wrong, an ability to spot the signs that other people missed. And when she saw a teenage girl lying on the shoulder of a highway in the rain with no coat and no phone, she knew exactly what she was looking at. Gloria didn't just call 911 and wait for the ambulance to arrive. She sat with me in her car with the heater running at full blast, wrapping me in the emergency blanket she kept in her trunk, rubbing my hands and arms trying to get my circulation going again. She checked my backpack and found school textbooks and homework, which told her I was a student who'd been coming from or going to school when something went wrong. She looked at my clothes, which were soaking wet but not damaged or torn, which suggested I hadn't been in an accident or attacked. She noticed I didn't have a phone or wallet or any of the things a teenage girl would normally carry, which meant either I'd lost them somehow or I'd left home in a hurry without time to grab my essentials. And she put all these pieces together in her mind and came to a conclusion that made her absolutely furious, in that cold, controlled way that veteran social workers get when they encounter a case that hits too close to home. When the ambulance arrived, she rode with me to the hospital and stayed there even though her shift had officially ended hours ago, because she wanted to be present when my father showed up to answer some very difficult questions about his parenting choices. The emergency room was controlled chaos, nurses and doctors moving with practiced efficiency, while I drifted in and out of awareness. I remember fragments, harsh fluorescent lights burning my eyes, heated blankets piled on top of me, someone saying my core temperature was too low, a woman's voice telling me I was safe now. When my father arrived about 40 minutes after the ambulance brought me in, Gloria Hensley was waiting for him with a clipboard and a list of questions that she'd been mentally composing since she found me on that roadside. Officer Daniels was there too, along with another officer, both of them standing with their hands resting casually near their belts in that way cops do when they're not expecting trouble, but want to be ready just in case. My father tried to explain what had happened, started telling them about the pills and the stolen money, and how he'd only meant to teach me a lesson. He'd thought I would go to a friend's house or come back and apologise after I'd had time to think about what I'd done. Gloria listened to his explanation with a completely neutral expression that didn't reveal what she was thinking, letting him talk himself into a hole while she took notes on her clipboard. Then she started asking her own questions in that deceptively calm voice that experienced investigators use when they're building a case. She asked how long he'd known about this supposed drug problem, asked what steps he'd taken to address it before resorting to throwing his daughter out of the house. She asked if he'd contacted a doctor or counsellor or anyone qualified to help with addiction issues. She asked if he'd called the police to report the drug dealing he claimed to have evidence of. She asked why he'd removed his daughter's access to her phone and money, which made it impossible for her to call for help when she got into trouble. She asked if he understood that the temperature had been dropping into dangerous levels all afternoon, and that the Weather Service had issued warnings about hypothermia risks. Each question was delivered in that same neutral tone, but the implications were devastating, and my father's explanations got weaker and more defensive with every answer. Then Gloria asked to see the evidence he'd mentioned, the pills and money and text messages that had supposedly prompted his actions. My father fumbled with his phone, trying to pull up the messages Karen had shown him, but he couldn't find them, because of course they'd never actually been on my phone. Karen had faked them somehow, or shown him something on her own phone and claimed it was mine. The pills and money were back at the house, he said. He'd left them there when the police called, hadn't thought to bring them because he'd been too worried about getting to the hospital. Gloria made a note on her clipboard and said they would need to examine all that evidence as part of their investigation, that an officer would accompany him back to his house to collect everything and document it properly. Then she said something that made my father's face go even paler than it already was. She said that based on what she'd observed and what he'd told her, she had concerns about my safety and well-being in his home, that Child Protective Services would be opening a formal investigation into potential neglect and endangerment. She said I would not be returning to his house tonight or any night in the immediate future, that they would be placing me with a suitable relative while the investigation proceeded, and if they determined that his actions rose to the level of criminal endangerment, he could face charges. My father started protesting, saying this was all a misunderstanding, saying he'd made a mistake, but he loved his daughter and would never intentionally hurt me. Officer Daniels cut him off and said that regardless of his intentions, the fact remained that he'd forced a 15-year-old girl out into dangerous weather without adequate clothing or means of communication, and she'd nearly died as a result. They had to investigate, and he needed to cooperate fully if he wanted any chance of regaining custody. While all this was happening in the waiting area, I was finally starting to come back to myself in the emergency room, the warming treatments bringing my core temperature back up and my brain starting to function more clearly. A nurse with kind eyes and gentle hands was checking my vitals when I finally managed to ask what had happened, where I was, if I was in trouble for something. She smoothed the hair back from my forehead and told me I was safe, that I'd been found on the road and brought to the hospital, that a very nice woman from Child Services was outside talking to my father right now and making sure everything was going to be okay. Then she asked me a question that made my eyes fill with tears. I was too exhausted to fight back. She asked if there was someone I wanted them to call, someone who would come be with me and make sure I was taken care of while all this got sorted out. Someone who had saved me before when I needed saving most, and would save me again now if I just said her name. I gave them my grandmother Dorothy's phone number, and the nurse stepped out to make the call, while I lay there trying to process everything that had happened in the space of a few hours. Dorothy lived about 25 minutes away under normal conditions, But I knew she'd make it in 15 because that's the kind of woman she was. Someone who didn't let obstacles slow her down when someone she loved needed her. Sure enough, I heard her voice in the hallway exactly 14 minutes later. That familiar, sharp tone she used when she was worried and trying to hide it behind anger, because anger felt safer than showing vulnerability. She was demanding to know where her granddaughter was and why nobody had called her sooner, and whether everyone in this hospital was incompetent or just criminally negligent, her voice getting louder with each word, until I heard a nurse trying to calm her down. The curtain around my bed swept aside, and there she was, my grandmother Dorothy, who'd raised my mother and tried her best to stay involved in my life even after my mother died and my father remarried someone who didn't particularly want her around. She was 71 years old then, a small, fierce woman with steel grey hair cut in a practical bob and eyes that could pin you to the wall when she was angry. Right then, she looked absolutely furious and terrified in equal measure. Her face pale and her hands shaking slightly as she took in the sight of me, wrapped in blankets with an IV line and monitoring equipment. She came to my bedside and cupped my face in her hands, searching my eyes like she was trying to make sure I was really there and really okay. And then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "If that man hurt you, I will end him." Not yelling, but in a voice so cold and certain that the nurse actually took a step backward. Then Dorothy's face crumpled, and she pulled me into her arms and held me while I cried. All the shock and fear and confusion of the past few hours pouring out in great heaving sobs that I couldn't control. When I finally calmed down enough to speak, I told her everything that had happened, starting from the moment I'd walked through the door that afternoon. I described my father's accusations and the evidence Karen claimed to have found, the pills and money and text messages that I swore I'd never seen before. I told her how he'd thrown me out into the storm without my phone or coat, how I'd tried to walk to her house but hadn't made it because the cold had overwhelmed me. Dorothy's expression went through several distinct phases as I talked, starting with disbelief and moving through anger and landing finally on something cold and dangerous that I'd never seen on her face before. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her jaw working like she was physically chewing on her rage. Then she stood up and said in a voice like iron that I was not going back to that house, that I would be staying with her for as long as necessary, and that my father was going to answer for what he'd done, whether he liked it or not. She walked out of the room with purpose in every step, and I heard her in the hallway asking where she could find Gloria Hensley from Child Protective Services, because they needed to have a conversation about justice and accountability right this minute. What happened over the next several days felt like watching a machine methodically take apart a building, piece by piece, exposing all the structural weaknesses that had been hidden behind a nice facade. Gloria Hensley opened a formal investigation and assigned a team to examine every aspect of my home situation. Officer Daniels and his partner went back to my father's house with a warrant to search my room and collect the evidence he'd claimed existed. And what they found there was both damning and revealing. The pills were exactly where he'd said they would be, but when the officers examined them more closely, they noticed something interesting. The prescriptions were all made out to Karen, not to me, and pharmacy records showed she'd reported them lost or stolen shortly after filling them. The cash was another problem, because my father couldn't explain how he knew the exact amount unless he'd been keeping meticulous records, which he admitted he hadn't been doing. And the bills themselves raised questions, mostly 20s and 10s, but also several 50s mixed in. And my father never carried 50s because he didn't like dealing with large bills that were hard to break. Karen, on the other hand, worked as a server at an upscale restaurant where customers frequently tipped with $50 bills. As for the text messages that had supposedly proven I was in contact with drug dealers, those conveniently couldn't be found on my phone when the police examined it. There was no record of them in my message history, no deleted conversations that could be recovered, nothing at all that supported his story. Gloria interviewed me extensively, asking detailed questions about my relationship with Karen and whether there had been any tension or conflict between us. I told her honestly that Karen and I had never been particularly close, that she'd always been my father's favourite and seemed to resent any attention he gave to me. But I'd never imagined she hated me enough to do something like this. Gloria nodded, like that fit with what she'd already suspected, and then asked whether there had been any recent changes in the household dynamics that might have triggered Karen's actions. I thought about it for a moment, and then remembered something that suddenly took on new significance. About 2 months earlier, my father had sat Karen down and told her that she needed to start paying rent if she was going to keep living at home. That she was 19 years old, with a job, and it was time for her to contribute financially to the household. Karen had been furious about this, had argued that she was saving money for her own place and couldn't afford to pay rent. But my father had been firm about it. He'd given her until the end of October to start paying $300 a month or find somewhere else to live. Gloria's eyebrows went up when I told her this, and she asked me to confirm the timeline, to make absolutely sure that my father's ultimatum to Karen had happened before the accusations against me started. I thought back through the sequence of events and realised with a sick feeling in my stomach that my father had given Karen that deadline exactly 2 weeks before she supposedly discovered I was stealing and using drugs. The pieces were falling into place in a pattern that was obvious once you knew to look for it. Karen had needed to deflect attention away from herself and her financial problems, had needed to make my father angry at someone else so he'd forget about demanding rent money from her. What better way than by framing her younger sister for something serious enough to justify kicking me out of the house, which would solve Karen's problem in 2 ways, by distracting my father and removing me from the house entirely. The investigation moved quickly once the police and child services understood what they were looking at. Officer Daniels brought Karen in for questioning at the station, and according to what Dorothy heard later from her neighbour who worked there, Karen had stuck to her story initially, but started contradicting herself when pressed on specific details. She claimed she'd found the pills in my closet, but couldn't explain why they were prescribed to her name. She claimed she'd seen suspicious text messages, but couldn't remember any specific content or phone numbers. She insisted the money must have been stolen, even though the bills didn't match what our father typically carried. The more questions they asked, the more her story fell apart like wet tissue paper. And eventually, she made a critical mistake. She got angry and defensive, and said something along the lines of nobody understanding how hard it was to live in that house, how she'd done what she had to do to survive. And if I'd been collateral damage, then that wasn't really her fault. That statement was enough for the police to shift their investigation into a criminal matter, and they brought charges against Karen for filing false reports, for planting evidence, for fraud in reporting her prescriptions as stolen when she'd actually been stockpiling them to frame me. Child Protective Services concluded their investigation by determining that my father had acted recklessly in throwing me out without verifying Karen's accusations, that he'd endangered my life through negligence, even if he hadn't intended to cause me serious harm. They recommended that I remain in my grandmother's custody and that my father complete parenting classes and counselling before any reunification could be considered. My father, to his credit, or maybe just his shame, didn't fight their recommendations. He signed the temporary custody papers, giving Dorothy full legal authority over me, and then he did something I hadn't expected. He asked if he could see me, not to argue or justify himself, but to apologise. And Dorothy told me the choice was mine to make. Nobody could force me either way. But there was something in her eyes when she said it that told me she knew what I needed to hear, even if the words would hurt going down. Dorothy asked me what I wanted to do about my father's request to see me, made it clear that the choice was entirely mine and she would support whatever I decided. I told her I needed time to think about it, which was the truth, but also a way of avoiding a decision I wasn't ready to make. In the end, I told Dorothy I would see him, but only with her present, and only at a time and place of my choosing, which turned out to be her living room, 3 days after I was released from the hospital. My father arrived, looking like he'd aged a decade in less than a week, his face haggard and his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. He sat on Dorothy's couch, across from where I was curled up in the armchair that had been my favourite spot since I was a little girl, and he tried to find words adequate to the situation he'd created. He said he was sorry, his voice cracking with emotion, said he'd been stupid and blind and had let Karen manipulate him into believing the worst about me without questioning or investigating. He said he understood if I never forgave him, that he didn't deserve forgiveness, but he needed me to know that he regretted everything. I listened without interrupting, watching his face and trying to figure out if any of this mattered, if an apology could somehow undo the damage or restore what had been broken. When he finished, I was quiet for a long moment, gathering my thoughts. Then I told him the problem wasn't just that he'd believed Karen's lies, though that was certainly part of it. The real problem was that he'd been so willing to believe them, so ready to think the worst of me without requiring any real proof. I said it revealed something about how he saw me, about the role I played in his life after my mother died, and he remarried and started building a new family that didn't have much room for the old one. I said he'd been looking for a reason to be disappointed in me, because disappointment was easier than grief, easier than dealing with the fact that I reminded him every day of the wife he'd lost. My father started to protest, but I held up my hand and told him I wasn't finished. He closed his mouth and nodded, tears running down his face, and I continued. I told him what I'd decided about our relationship going forward, which was that I would be staying with Dorothy permanently and not coming back to his house, even after Child Services closed their investigation. I said I would talk to him occasionally if he wanted to stay in touch, would maybe have dinner with him once in a while at neutral locations, but I couldn't live under his roof again because I would never feel safe there. My father accepted this with a kind of defeated resignation, said he understood and wouldn't fight me on it. He left Dorothy's house that day looking smaller than when he'd arrived, diminished by the weight of what he'd done. Dorothy stood in the doorway watching him drive away, her arm around my shoulders, and for a moment I thought everything was settled, that we'd reached some kind of resolution. But as the weeks passed and Karen's trial date approached, I started to understand that healing wasn't a straight line. It was a messy zigzag through territory I didn't know how to navigate. The trial happened in early spring, 6 months after that October night. Dorothy thought the stress of facing Karen in court would be harmful to my recovery, so I didn't attend most of it. But the district attorney asked me to be present for the verdict because she thought it would help me find closure. I sat in the back of the courtroom, with Dorothy beside me, watching the jury file in with expressions I couldn't read. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the foreman stood up and said they had, found the defendant guilty on all counts. Karen was sitting at the defense table with her lawyer, and when she heard those words, something inside her just shattered. She started sobbing, not the delicate tears she'd used to manipulate my father, but huge, ugly, gasping sobs that shook her whole body. She turned around in her seat, looking for my father in the gallery, and when their eyes met, I saw something pass between them that I'd never seen before. He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts pity and disgust, like he was finally seeing her clearly for the first time and couldn't believe what he was looking at. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years of probation, plus restitution to cover my medical bills and the investigation costs. Karen's lawyer tried to argue for a lighter sentence, talked about her youth and her lack of prior criminal history and how she'd been under stress. But the judge cut him off. She said that what Karen had done wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated campaign of lies that had nearly cost her sister's life. And that kind of premeditated cruelty demanded consequences. Karen was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, still crying, still looking back at my father like she couldn't understand why he wasn't rushing forward to save her the way he always had before. But he just sat there with his head in his hands. And I realized, with a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness, that he was finally mourning the daughter he thought he had, finally understanding that the golden child had been fool's gold all along. Jolene filed for divorce 2 months into Karen's sentence. I heard about it through Dorothy, who heard about it through the neighborhood gossip chain that somehow knew everything about everyone. Apparently, Jolene showed up at the house one afternoon with a moving truck and 2 men, who loaded up half the furniture while my father was at work, left the divorce papers on the kitchen table, with a note that said she hadn't signed up for this kind of drama. Dorothy said good riddance to her, and I agreed, though I felt a small pang of something that might have been pity for my father, who was losing everything, one piece at a time, because he'd made bad choices and believed the wrong person. But mostly, I was too busy learning how to live again to spend much time thinking about the family I'd lost. Living with Dorothy turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me, despite the traumatic circumstances that brought me there. Her house was small but comfortable, filled with the kind of warm clutter that comes from decades of life lived in one place. Books stacked on every surface and photographs covering the walls like wallpaper made of memories. She gave me the guest room that had been my mother's childhood bedroom, still decorated with some of the same furniture from 30 years earlier, and told me I could change anything I wanted or leave it exactly as it was. I chose to leave it mostly unchanged because being surrounded by my mother's history felt comforting somehow, like she was still watching over me. Dorothy had rules about homework and chores and curfew, but they were reasonable rules, enforced with consistency rather than the arbitrary mood-based discipline that had characterized my father's house. She made dinner every night, and we ate together at the kitchen table, talking about our days and making plans for the weekend, establishing routines that felt solid and dependable. For the first time since my mother died, I felt like someone was paying attention to me as an individual rather than as a role or a problem or a disappointment. I started to heal in that house, not just from the hypothermia and the trauma of that October night, but from years of feeling invisible and unimportant in my father's home. Dorothy noticed when I was having a bad day and would make my favourite foods or suggest we watch a movie together. Small gestures that communicated care without making a big production of it. She asked about my friends and my classes and my goals for the future, actually listening to my answers instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. I enrolled in a new school across town where nobody knew my story, and I could just be a regular 15-year-old student trying to get through algebra without any additional drama. That anonymity was precious to me. But healing takes time, and some wounds leave scars that change shape over the years, growing fainter in some places and deeper in others, depending on what life throws at you. And I was about to discover that the story I thought was finished was really just beginning its next chapter. Years passed and wounds healed slowly, the way deep cuts do, knitting themselves back together in layers that sometimes pulled tight and sometimes stayed tender, depending on the weather and the memories. I finished high school with honours despite everything, got accepted to a good state university with enough scholarship money that Dorothy didn't have to drain her savings. She came to my college graduation looking proud enough to burst, taking approximately 700 photographs and embarrassing me by cheering so loudly when they called my name that people 3 rows away turned to look. My father sent a card with a check inside and a note saying he was proud of me, which I acknowledged with a brief thank you text because our relationship had settled into that kind of distant civility where we maintained contact without ever really connecting. After graduation, I got a job at a software company in Boston, started at entry level and worked my way up through determination and the kind of work ethic that Dorothy had instilled in me. I was good at what I did, good enough that promotions came regularly and my salary climbed into ranges that would have seemed impossible to that 15-year-old girl shivering on a roadside. I met Colin when I was 25, at a coffee shop near my office, one of those chance encounters that could have gone nowhere, but somehow didn't. He was struggling with his laptop and muttering curses under his breath about software updates ruining everything. I made a comment about technology being both salvation and curse. He laughed and asked if I worked in tech, and somehow that turned into a 2-hour conversation that made me completely forget about the work I was supposed to be doing. We started dating in that casual way that people do, coffee meetings and movie nights, and gradually realizing that we enjoyed each other's company more than we enjoyed being alone. Colin was steady and calm and unflappable in ways that felt like a refuge after growing up in a household where emotions ran hot and conflicts exploded without warning. He knew about my history because I'd learned that hiding trauma only gives it more power, but he never treated me like I was damaged or fragile. We'd been together for 3 years when he proposed, and it wasn't anything like the romantic gestures in movies with rose petals and public declarations. It was a random Tuesday evening, and we were in my apartment, sitting on my couch in our usual spots, with takeout containers scattered on the coffee table, and some documentary about ocean life playing on the television that neither of us were really watching. Colin had been quiet all evening in a way that seemed different from his normal, comfortable silence, and I'd been trying to figure out if something was wrong or if I was just imagining things. Then he suddenly muted the television and turned to face me with an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. And he said my name in a way that made my heart start beating faster, even though I didn't know why yet. He said he'd been thinking about us, and about the future, and about what he wanted his life to look like in 10 years, and 20 years, and 50 years if he was lucky enough to live that long. He said every version of that future he imagined had me in it, that somewhere along the way I'd gone from being someone he was dating to being someone he couldn't imagine living without, and he wanted to know if I felt the same way. Because if I did, then maybe we should make it official and permanent, and all the other scary words that meant commitment. He wasn't holding a ring, and he wasn't down on one knee. He was just looking at me with those steady brown eyes that had never lied to me, or looked through me, or made me feel like I was anything other than exactly enough. I felt something crack open in my chest, something that had been locked tight since that October night when I learned that the people who were supposed to love you could also be the ones who hurt you most. I said yes, before he'd even finished explaining himself. Said it multiple times while tears ran down my face. Said it until he was laughing and kissing me and telling me he'd been terrified I was going to say I needed more time to think about it. We sat on that couch for hours afterward, talking about the future in ways I'd never let myself before, making plans that assumed tomorrow would come and we'd be in it together. Dorothy was delighted when I told her, immediately launching into plans for hosting the reception at her house, because that's where all the important events of my life had happened, and she wasn't about to break tradition now. I agreed because I couldn't imagine celebrating anywhere else, in that house where I'd been rebuilt piece by piece and learned what family was supposed to look like. That's when the letter arrived, 3 weeks after I got engaged, changing the trajectory of my thoughts about the past and forcing me to make decisions I'd thought I'd already made years ago. Dorothy called me on a Saturday morning, saying something had come for me at her house, her voice careful and neutral in that way she had when she was trying not to influence my reactions. I drove down that weekend wondering what could possibly warrant that tone, and found her waiting at the kitchen table with an envelope in front of her like it was something dangerous that needed to be approached cautiously. The envelope was plain white, with cheap paper that felt thin between my fingers, the handwriting shaky and uncertain in a way I barely recognized, even though I knew whose hand had written it. The return address was Maple Grove Care Centre, a nursing home about an hour from where I'd grown up, where apparently my father had been living for reasons I was about to discover. I opened it at Dorothy's kitchen table, with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands. The letter began with an apology for reaching out after so many years of limited contact, acknowledging that my father had no right to ask anything of me, but was asking anyway because time was running out. He explained that he'd had a stroke 2 years earlier, a major one that had left his left side partially paralysed and his speech affected. That he was living in the nursing home because he could no longer manage on his own. Jolene had left him years ago, he wrote, had divorced him and moved to Florida with someone she'd met online. The house was sold to pay medical bills, everything was gone, and he was facing the end with nothing but his regrets. He said Karen had visited him once the previous week, but he'd refused to see her, couldn't bear to look at her face or hear her voice after what she'd done and what he'd allowed to happen. The letter continued with more apologies, my father trying to articulate the depth of his regret for that October night and all the choices that had led up to it. He said he thought about me constantly, wondered about my life and whether I was happy, and whether I'd managed to build something good despite the terrible foundation he'd given me. He said he understood if I never wanted to see him again, that he'd forfeited any claim to my love or attention. But he was asking anyway if I could find it in my heart to visit him just once before he died, so he could apologize in person. He signed it with his name, Raymond. Not Dad or Father, just his name, like he'd lost the right to those titles and knew better than to presume. I set the letter down and stared at it for a long moment while my coffee went cold, trying to figure out what I felt. Dorothy waited until I was ready to talk, then asked me gently what I wanted to do, making it clear that whatever I decided would be supported without judgment. I told her I didn't know, that part of me wanted to ignore the letter and continue living my life without reopening old wounds. But another part of me, the part that had learned empathy and forgiveness during those years in Dorothy's care, wondered if maybe I owed it to myself to face my father one last time and see if closure was possible. We talked for hours that afternoon, going through all the angles and considerations, what it would mean to see him versus what it would mean to refuse. In the end, I decided to go, but not for the reasons my father probably hoped. I wasn't going to absolve him of guilt or make his dying easier. I was going because I needed to look him in the eye as an adult and let him see what I'd become despite everything he'd done. Needed him to understand that I'd survived and thrived and built a life that had nothing to do with him or his approval. The nursing home was exactly what I expected, one of those places that tries to disguise institutional care with cheerful paint colours, but can't hide the underlying smell of disinfectant mixed with decay. Maple Grove Care Centre occupied a low brick building on the edge of town, and I checked in at the front desk where a tired-looking receptionist gave me directions to room 112. I followed the signs through corridors that all looked identical, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and I felt my chest tighten with emotions I couldn't quite name. Room 112 was at the end of the hall, door partially open, television playing some show that nobody was watching. I stood outside for a moment, gathering my courage, then knocked gently and stepped inside. My father was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, his left arm hanging useless in his lap, and his face sagging on that side in the characteristic way of stroke victims. When he turned to see who had entered, his expression went through rapid changes. Disbelief first, then overwhelming emotion that made his eyes fill with tears, then something that looked almost like fear. He tried to say my name, but the stroke had taken some of his language abilities, and it came out garbled, so instead he just reached toward me with his good hand in a gesture that was simultaneously pleading and welcoming. I pulled the visitor chair close and sat down, taking in the details of how much he'd changed. He'd always been a solid man, but the stroke had diminished him into something fragile and uncertain. His hair had gone completely grey and thinned until his scalp showed through. His face was deeply lined with wrinkles that came from pain rather than laughter, and his eyes had a watery quality that made him look perpetually on the verge of tears. He kept staring at me like he was trying to memorize my face, and eventually he managed to form words that were slow and slurred, but understandable. He said thank you for coming, his voice breaking, said he'd been blind and stupid and cruel 13 years ago, said throwing me into that storm was the biggest mistake of his life, and he'd thought about it every single day since. I let him finish, then took a deep breath and started talking in a voice that was calm and steady, even though my hands were shaking. I told him that I forgave him, watched his face crumple with relief. But then I held up my hand because I wasn't finished, and he needed to hear all of it. I said forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or pretending the past didn't happen. It meant I was choosing not to carry anger anymore, because anger was heavy, and I was done letting him take up space in my heart. I said he'd thrown me into a storm because it was easier than questioning his favourite daughter, easier than admitting he might have been wrong about who deserved his trust. I said he hadn't just endangered my life that night, he'd sent me a message about my worth that I'd spent years trying to unlearn. The message that I was disposable and my pain didn't matter as much as his comfort. I told him about the life I'd built without him, pulling out my phone to show him pictures of my apartment and Colin and the work I was proud of, making him see that I'd succeeded despite the terrible foundation he'd given me. I said I'd put myself through college, had built a career through hard work that Dorothy had taught me, had found love with someone who would never throw me away, no matter what lies anyone told. I said I was happy and successful and about to get married in Dorothy's house, surrounded by people who actually cared about me. And none of that had anything to do with him, except that his rejection had taught me exactly what kind of parent I never wanted to be. My father was crying openly now, tears streaming down the functioning side of his face, and he kept nodding like every word I said was a blow he knew he deserved. When I finished, he managed to choke out that he was proud of me, that seeing what I'd become made his heart hurt in ways he couldn't describe. I sat with him for another 20 minutes, talking about surface things that felt safe, my job and Colin's work and Dorothy's health. He listened like it was the most important information in the world, asking questions when he could form them properly. When I finally stood up to leave, he reached out with his good hand, and I let him touch my fingers for a moment. A brief connection that felt like goodbye in the permanent sense. In the hallway outside his room, I stood for a moment trying to compose myself, trying to figure out what I felt now that I'd said everything I needed to say. That's when a nurse approached me, an older woman with kind eyes and grey hair pulled back in a practical bun. She asked if I was Raymond's daughter, and I said yes, expecting her to tell me about his care plan or medication schedule. Instead, she said something that stopped me cold. She told me my sister had been coming to the reception desk every few days for the past 2 weeks, asking about visiting hours and whether her father was well enough for visitors. The nurse said they'd asked Raymond each time if he wanted to see Karen, and each time he'd refused so vehemently that they'd stopped asking. She said the last time Karen had shown up, just 3 days ago, Raymond had gotten so agitated at the mention of her name that they'd had to give him medication to calm him down. The nurse leaned in closer and lowered her voice like she was sharing a confidence. She said Raymond had told them very clearly that he could only stomach apologizing to one daughter, and it wasn't Karen, that he couldn't look at her face without seeing what she'd done and what he'd allowed to happen because he'd been too blind to question her lies. She said Karen had actually made it into the building that day before they'd stopped her, that she'd been crying and begging to see him, saying she needed to apologize and make things right. But Raymond had shouted from his room that she needed to leave, that he had nothing to say to her and didn't want her forgiveness or her excuses. The nurse said it was one of the saddest things she'd witnessed in 30 years of working in elder care, watching a father reject his own daughter while that daughter stood in the hallway sobbing. But she also said, and this part she delivered with a slight knowing smile, that sometimes the people we think we've lost forever turn out to be the ones who deserved to be lost, and the people we hold on to are the ones worth keeping. I stood in that hallway processing this information, feeling something shift in my chest that I couldn't quite identify. After all those years of being the rejected one, the throwaway daughter, the one who wasn't good enough to keep, my father had finally rejected Karen in turn. It wasn't satisfaction I felt exactly, though there was a small dark part of me that appreciated the poetic justice. It was more like closure, like the final page of a very long book turning and allowing me to set it on the shelf and walk away. I thanked the nurse and walked out of Maple Grove Care Centre into October sunshine, the same month that had nearly killed me 13 years earlier, but with completely different weather and completely different meaning. October used to mean rain and betrayal and hypothermia, but now it meant falling leaves and the anniversary of when my real life had begun, in Dorothy's house, the month when I'd stopped being my father's daughter and started being my own person. Colin was waiting when I got back to Boston that evening, takeout already on the counter, and that patient, understanding expression that said he wouldn't push me to talk until I was ready. I went straight to him and wrapped my arms around him, absorbing the solid realness of someone who chose to stay. He asked how it went, and I told him I thought I was finally done, that I'd said what I needed to say and could let it go now. The wedding happened that following spring exactly as planned. A small ceremony in Dorothy's backyard with close friends and good food, and none of the family drama that had characterized so much of my early life. Dorothy cried through the entire ceremony, despite claiming she had something in her eye. And I stood there saying my vows with Colin's hands warm in mine, making plans that assumed tomorrow would come and we'd be in it together. Some storms don't destroy you, I realized standing in that garden. Some storms redirect you toward better destinations than you would have found on your own. That October night, 13 years ago, I'd lost a house, but found my home. I'd lost a father who'd never deserved me, and found a grandmother who did. I'd lost a sister who'd never loved me, and gained the opportunity to become someone stronger than I would have been if everything had stayed comfortable and easy. Standing there in Dorothy's garden on that spring afternoon with my chosen family around me and my real life stretching ahead full of possibility, I knew with absolute certainty that I'd survived exactly what I needed to survive, to become exactly who I was meant to be. The girl who'd been thrown away had learned she was never garbage to begin with, just someone precious that the wrong people hadn't known how to value. And that understanding, hard-won and painful as it was, turned out to be worth every frozen step on that dark road, every tear shed in hospital beds, every moment of doubt about whether I deserved better. I did deserve better, and I built it with my own 2 hands.